Hi everyone, my name is Declan McGlynn and today we are super excited to be joined by a producer who's released on the likes of Ministry of Sound and Black Butter. Today we're going to talk a little bit about one of his new singles released on his own label, and it's Kidnap Kid. How are you doing, sir?
Very well, thanks. How are you doing?
Good, welcome to Point Blank.
Thank you very much.
So we're going to dive into Brokenhearted in a second and take a look at how you made it. I just want to ask you a few questions first about how you started making music. I mean, what were those first tracks like that you first started making?
Just like beyond belief. They were so bad.
Do you still have them?
Well, I came across a hard drive quite recently I was like, my big thing getting into dance music was jungle, so I was made just endless hard drives full of terrible jungle. I might bury in my back garden one day. I hope that no one finds them. But so that was my entry point quite a while ago. Yeah.
Yeah, and what were you using at the time? Was it always Reason?
Yeah, same program I've been using for the past 10 years really. A friend just gave me a copy, and that was the only thing I've ever used since.
And who were your influences at the time? Were you DJing as well at the time?
Yeah, I started DJing a few months before I then kind of got the producer bug as well, but that was how I got into it. I just started buying records and really enjoyed that, and then natural progression is, you just kind of want to work out how they're making them and start doing your own stuff. So
yeah, so everything was all just self-taught.
Yeah. As I kind of got a bit more in depth, you can kind of pick a few kind of pieces from like YouTube tutorials and stuff. But I think it was just years and years of exploring with it. Really, I was so hooked. It was just every day I was coming back from school, and that was all I'd do all evening.
Yeah.
Which I actually feel bad at my mum sometimes. She must have heard a lot of terrible music, but yeah.
And what were the biggest struggles for you when you first started producing? And was it the mixing? Was it the composition?
I guess it's a lot of it looking back. At the time, I thought it was my inability with using the software and being like, oh, this mix doesn't sound right. But looking back at the music I was actually writing now, it was naive musically more than technically really. And I think that's the problem is, I wasn't just learning how to produce, I was learning how to write music from the ground up. And so it was really just terrible. And you can be the most amazing producer in the world, but if the music behind the track isn't particularly interesting or emotive, then it's never going to sound good. And so I think I spent a long time focusing on learning the technical side of things when I should have been exploring the musical side of things.
Yeah,
really.
Absolutely. I guess that's kind of a common problem these days in music you hear, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. That's what I should have been focusing on. But these are lessons you kind of learn in time, and the two have developed together. So
yeah, and you just recently started your own label, Birds That Fly. I mean, what was the ethos behind that?
I guess why I started it originally was labels are a tricky thing. They've always got release schedules that are backed up by a year, and if you want to be getting music out and be able to control when and the aesthetic and everything, unless you're have a label that you release on consistently and are really close to them, it can be quite tricky. So a lot of it was about getting some control over the process, and that's been kind of really I really enjoy that side of things. And another thing was I was getting sent music from other people that I thought was amazing, who were having a similar struggle, and I was like, well, there's one solution to all of these problems, and it's worked out really well so far.
So you're taking on other people's tracks as well?
Yeah, so there's kind of a few bits and pieces that I feel like work well with the sort of stuff I'm writing that I'm putting out as well. So.
Cool. So this track, I mean, maybe you could start off by telling us how it started. I mean, how do tracks start for you generally?
It really, do you know what, they're usually, each track, like the idea for the next track will usually come about in the last 30 seconds of the track that I finished before. There'll be some
handy.
So far it's worked out, yeah. I'll get to a full stop one day. Oh no. It'll be like some just kind of interesting little musical idea that kind of came about, and then you're like, oh, that's the starting point for the next one. So I was actually finishing a track that I didn't end up putting out for various reasons, and in the kind of just as I was finishing it, I just did this little tweak on it with this piano line. I was like, oh, that's really nice, and then that became the starting point for this thing. I can't remember specifically where that now exists in the current track, but yeah, it's just some little thing that catches your ear and spirals from there.
Yeah, and would you start off, I mean, you come from the jungle background, would you start off programming drums? Or was it always a musical idea first?
Oh yeah, so funnily enough, even though that was my background, the drums are pretty much always the last thing I work on in a track, even though it's dance music. It might be counterintuitive, but it's always the piano first, so everything starts there, so just melody and chord progressions and I feel like if that was an important lesson in my development, I think, because you want to be able to make sure that there's emotive energy inherent in the notes rather than relying on percussion, or this is my way around of doing things. I feel like if I have a percussion track in there, I can play some chords over it, and it already has like energy because there's percussion, and you can be like, oh yeah, that'll do, that sort of thing. But if it's stripped back and there's nothing in there, then and you're kind of getting this really exciting energy just from the movement of the notes, then you're like, okay, this is a really interesting musical idea. Then once you put percussion behind it, it kind of brings it to life even more. And so I like to do things that way around.
Yeah, sure. So maybe we should listen to some of the track and you can just solo, maybe some musical bits, and we can talk about them.
So yeah, a little snapshot of it there, I guess. Well, it would be a good place to start looking at some stuff. Aha. So yeah, I think this might have actually been the starting point. It's just a kind of simple melody. So I think what's going on here, this is a sampler. Because it doesn't take third-party plugins, you're quite restricted with what you can use in Reason. Mm-hmm. And some of the synths are great, but they have quite a distinct sound to them that maybe it's because I'm so familiar with the software, but they are very instantly recognizable, and I'm like, oh, that's just a recent synth, and kind of want to shy away from that a little bit. So I find I use samplers a lot. This is at the NN19, and I think this is just like a piano note I recorded, just a single note that I've put in a sampler and created the melody with it here. The reason I like the samplers is you can get some quite expressive stuff out of it, because inbuilt in the velocity channel that you can affect, you can choose what that applies to basically. So here I've got amplitude and sample start and decay. So if I change the velocity here, it's actually meaning that each note's being kind of plucked harder and sustaining for a different amount of time, depending on where it is. And you can get it. It feels like ever so slightly more like it's being played live.
Yeah, it's got more articulation within it. Yeah,
that's the word I was looking for.
Yeah,
yeah. And so that's kind of why I like the samplers really. And a technique I try and use throughout, even if it's only incredibly subtle. I feel like once there's multiple musical layers on top of each other, and you've used that variation throughout, where it's just being held a little bit longer on this note and a little bit shorter on this note, the whole thing just comes together and has a slightly more live feel.
Yeah, and it stops it from creating that kind of building blocks of loops, because they're constantly varied.
Yeah, exactly, and I make sure it's constantly varying throughout the track, and you're not just like, no, oh, there's this thing coming back in. This is some pitch bend here, so just very sharp pitch bend just on where the notes are being played, and you get a kind of like a little rise thing, and that can give it a plucked feel as well. So and then that just kind of sits on top of. It doesn't sound a huge amount like a piano hit at the minute, but it's just kind of heavily processed, and there's just a lot of reverb on there, and I think like there'll be 4 or 5 four-channel EQs to just kind of push certain frequencies. Yeah.
So that was originally a recorded piano.
Yeah, I think that was just like a middle C, just chuck into a sampler. And actually, like a lot of the stuff in this track will just be the same piano note, and sometimes it'll come out sounding more like a guitar, sometimes more like a strings. Just because I'm kind of, I guess where I get creative is in the processing rather than in the original recording. Again, something that will have stemmed from being stuck with, the limitations of the software at the beginning. This is kind of the main plucking line. So this is another way I've processed. I think this is the same piano hit as well, but this sounds more kind of like a plucked guitar, really. So I've just brought the decay and sustain right down, and it gives it a plucking feel. And here again, you can see the start where the sampler starts using the audio is varied by the velocity here as well, so it's moving along each time. So if you make that more uniform,
it's much more rigid.
Yeah, it sounds like someone on a computer basically doing that, and then you kind of put it back to that, and you get those little spikes there where it sounds like a little twang sort of thing. So yeah, I guess that would be one of the most important processes I use throughout, is to just...
And that's in all of your other tracks as well?
Yeah, everything I use ever, really. Just make sure there's just little things that sound like errors all the way throughout, really. And they're so kind of like subtle that when you're just listening to the solo tracks, they're not so noticeable, or you're like, there's not a huge amount of difference, but I feel like once everything's layered up together and you get the interplay between different mistakes, then it kind of gives it a good feel. So with percussion, I like to use a lot of layers. It'll sound just like it's one kit when the track's finished, but actually built in there'll be like 6 different snare layers and 6 different kick layers, just to kind of make sure you get everything in there. It really pushes through on the mix. And so on the kick, I think it's just this is just quite a regular subby kick. It's quite bare, and I guess if you go on a big system, it's got a nice kind of boom on the bottom and just a little pop on the top. And then I'll layer it up with just random bits of audio that I record and put in a sampler. I think one technique I use quite a lot is turn the gain right up on a microphone and just record myself kicking with various things in my studio, like tapping the walls. I think this here on top is a recording of me just kicking some empty boxes, and if you have the gain really high, you get all the like crackle and stuff off, and then you can just filter that out, and you get some really nice little crackly bits to put on top of your percussion. There's also like a tom that sits on top of the kick. So yeah, about 6 different layers there. One will be like a crackly white noise bit, one will be kind of just something to give it a pop, and then a subby bit, and in the end, once you're listening to the track as a whole, it just sounds like one thing.
So adding those white noise bits, I guess, makes the kick stand out more in the mix when it gets busier.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because otherwise, I find if you if I turn the kick up so it's as loud as I want it to be, then it's too boomy on the bottom, and just building up those layers kind of methodically is a way to make sure you can, just how you said, kind of have it push through in the mix and without being too excessive. So yeah, that would be the same without snares and stuff as well, and hi-hats. And I tend to use like just random drum breaks for my hi-hats because they have a nice loose feel. I'm not sure what that's from. I think a lot of the breaks I've got, my uncle gave me a load of disco records years and years ago, and there's loads of, it's just like a rich seam of drum breaks there, so I just kind of filter out the hi-hats and use that, because I find when I program hi-hats myself, they just always sound too rigid, so I've given up doing that. And then there's other bits and pieces like crackle loops, I think from the same records, like the beginning or the end, just little pops that you just put in there, and again by themselves sound very dull, but will give slight variations.
And I guess there's a sub bass that kind of runs underneath.
Yeah.
Is that just to kind of underpin that and represent the low frequencies a little bit more?
Yeah, it's I think the sub is actually literally the only synth I've used. It's a Thor, which tends to be the only synth I use out of reason, really. But that's the only synth in the track, just because it's very hard to generate something that, kind of pure sounding out of audio. There's a sub bass that runs throughout, but then again, it's all about the layers with everything, really. So on top of that, there's this, which is just a note I've recorded on my bass guitar, and that's just kind of got slightly more high end in it. And then I think there's like a piano that sits on top. This one. I just think that's kind of a third layer, and then I think there's like a bit of white noise that sits on top. There's this, another distorted piano. That one's kind of actually playing at the wrong note, just to kind of add a bit of discord as well. It kind of gives it an interesting feel. So yeah, you just kind of build things up that way.
So I guess you're approaching it in a way where every aspect needs to have its own representative across the frequency spectrum.
Yeah.
Everything from like very low to very high.
That's it.
Instead of trying to get one sound to do everything.
Yeah.
Just giving things a spot,
There's white noise even on the sub. It's kind of like counterintuitive, but making sure everything's fully represented.
Yeah.
It's more of kind of just the mixing technical side that when you looking at that, but it's a necessary evil of making music, basically.
Yeah, totally.
Making it presentable.
And it makes the final mix easier.
Well, I mean, so by doing this, the result is that I tend to actually not really mix my tracks. It's like by the time I've just about finished writing them, they'll be done, and I might spend an hour or something just doing some tweaking. But kind of building it in that way means that you're just mixing as you go, really. There's never a separate mix afterwards.
And you've got, like, I can see some notch filters there. Is that the kind of approach you have with EQing?
Yeah.
Just taking out some fundamentals.
Yeah, so I think on that piano, there's like, 7 EQs and 3 filters as well, and just various different bits. And with the audio thing, there's so much richness out of it, but so many harsh, unwanted frequencies go hand in hand with that, because it's, synths can be a lot purer, and so you end up with a lot of nasty little frequencies that you don't want. But I tend to kind of go through and sort of play this, and then I'll go through it and like say this one here is. Find that frequency. You don't want it to boost it really high, and if you just go through, if you turn it up really loud or listen to it on speakers, I find you can identify them better as well, like the point at which it's not just too loud, but it's like actually sounds quite stinging and unpleasant, and then you can just drop those out. And that's kind of the sort of process I go through there. And that's just the same on anything. There'll just be endless EQs sat on everything, just to kind of take out lots of nasty stuff. But
yeah, and once you have the kind of sounds in place and you've got your recordings in, how do you approach then arranging them into a track? I mean, is it a live jam that you do, or?
I find that kind of has to come actually more or less at the beginning, like within. I feel like there's the creative process. I have to pretty much get to the end of a track straight away, or I really struggle to go back and like arrange it. So even though it'll be an incredibly basic version of the track, I like to, as soon as the idea is rolling, I'm like, okay, we've got a few hours to get the structure and the core ideas completely down, because then I just, for some reason, I really struggle with arranging after that. And so
it's a classic issue where you just get stuck in a loop and everyone has it, where you focus too much on one idea that's like 40 seconds.
That's it, and you're
then
you're
you
too
don't know where to
familiar
go
with
from
it,
there,
and
yeah.
progressing
Exactly.
is difficult. You're like, everything sounds wrong after that. So, the tracks start rather than like making 30 seconds sound amazing and mixed. It would be like the whole thing has existed from the get-go, and we build it from the ground up there. So there's a 5-minute version, which is the first version I ever made, which will sound absolutely appalling in terms of mix and ideas, and there'll be lots of mistakes in there. But it's then a jam to kind of build up from rather than kind of building vertically rather than going out horizontally.
Yeah, and I guess that creative moment only lasts so long.
That's it.
Whereas the mixing scientific bit, you can come back to over and over again.
That's it.
You
It's
can
like,
rely on it a bit more.
I know I can do that day in, day out, even though
Yeah.
there's less of a, you have to be more caught in the moment in the creative side of things.
Yeah.
And trying to reignite that spark the next morning when you're a bit like tired and you're like, I just can't be bothered. So it's kind of feverish in a way, but you're like, when the idea strikes, you're like, okay, go. And then you've got a few hours to get it all down.
Yeah.
And then,
Is there a mastering process you go through? I mean, do you have put things in the master bus? Do you leave that till later on?
No, I have the master completely clean, basically.
Right.
I know people have, I think there's no right or wrong thing here. Well, there's no right or wrong technique with anything, but I just like to have I think I quite like the stuff to sound like quite crisp rather than like fat, and so I don't compress or EQ stuff really, and just,
Yeah, and then do you master your own stuff later, or do you?
No, so I don't just send it off to mastering house and get them to kind of do that bit. I'm not so familiar with that process.
Yeah, sure.
I do that self-masters for playing in the club.
Exactly,
but it never comes out sounding as good as, they have thousands and thousands of pounds worth of equipment that I don't have, and technical know-how that I don't have. So
Yeah, and just to kind of wrap up, I mean, what would be your advice to someone who's in a similar situation in a bedroom, kind of like trying to make their own tracks? I mean, what would you say to them?
I wish I'd spent more time learning how to write music rather than learning how to use a specific computer program or like how to EQ a drum track, because at the end of the day, that's what kind of generates interesting ideas, and that's what carries you through, is kind of that ability to, generate something emotive really. And so that's definitely the side of things I'd work on first. Sit at a piano rather than sitting at a computer, and then that would be my advice.
Nice one. All right, so there you go. If you guys want to learn a lot more about mixing, mastering, composition, and all that good stuff, make sure you check out our courses at pointblankmusicschool.com.